Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Florida, and Louisiana. These are the states in the United States that make up what we know today as the Southern U.S. This region is unique in the unusually powerful sense of self that it has, and it can be attributed to the attitude and habits that have been deeply instilled from the past. Country music, gospel music, moonshine, stock car racing, all of these invoke the image of the South. Proud to be called Southern, the way people perceive the South is that it is one culture. However, as we will see, various inputs of cultural influences, as well as slavery, impacted the way the South is today, being composed of various subcultures that make up the whole of the South. According to the text on page 167, the South can be viewed as a geographic composite of beliefs, attitudes, patterns, habits, and institutions associated with life in the entire group of Southeast states. To begin, the heritage of the South was shaped by the settlement patterns that people took as they settled there. As people from Europe immigrated to the colonies in the Americas, they began to realize the economic benefits of the different regions the colonies were a part of. While the North had some spots with good, fertile areas, generally the South contained the Atlantic coastal plain, which low elevation created rivers that were ideal for transportation of agricultural goods as well as growing crops. As a result, various urban clusters, such as Richmond, Columbia, and Augusta, formed at the heads of rivers. Likewise, port cities on the Atlantic, such as Charleston, Norfolk, Wilmington, and Savannah, had strong trade ties that connected the South to the North or the Caribbean by means of the Atlantic Ocean and boat. While urban clusters were popping up, most of the South was still rural and followed agrarian settlement patterns. These became increasingly more common as people moved further and further inland, spreading the population thinner over a larger area. While private-owned farms also dotted the southern region, as more and more land was claimed, European investors discovered the economic benefits of cash crop farming, and the South was further shaped by the introduction of the highly structured plantation. The financial successes of plantations quickly made the plantation the dominant entity in the South's economy. Even as early as 1612, according to our text, tobacco was grown along Virginia's James River. Throughout the various regions of the South, plantations created rice, indigo, tobacco, as I said, and cotton, among other things. The success of plantations prompted work to improve transportation to the trade cities, such as Charleston, by further shaping the South into a more easily traveled place for economic goods. This also, in turn, made it easier to get to more interior places, as well back to the ocean, for trade. The boom and success of cash crop plantations also prompted the need of slave labor. Realizing local native slaves often easily escaped, African slaves would be unfamiliar with the land and be less likely to run. Thus, a better slave. Shiploads of African slaves arrived and quickly became a large part of the plantation's success, as well as the South's population. However, this high input of slaves slowed down immigration from the northern states and eventually resulted in the South's white people being the fewest foreign-born than any other region of the country. As slaves became increasingly necessary for sustaining the South's economy, the impact of slavery inevitably put its mark on the South. Black slaves first arrived in 1619 in Virginia. Being present for so long in the South, their customs and cultural characteristics inevitably became part of the South's culture. As Africans were forced to the Americas, they undoubtedly still did the customs in which they were familiar with. From the way Southerners talked, to the yummy foods like fried okra, African culture undisputably rubbed off into some of these areas of Southern culture, becoming entwined with it. Despite subconsciously picking up traits from African culture, slavery also drove Southern plantation slave owners to have an unempathetic outlook on slaves. They were taught to think of themselves superior to slaves, thus snuffing out any possibility of remorse for the good of the plantation and thusly the economy. They adopted older ways of thinking, using religion, claiming that they were a higher, more superior being, and thusly were not considered a human being. Opposition of slavery, however, began in the North, and the idea made Southern slave owners feel like their livelihoods were at risk. Ultimately, this resulted in one of the main reasons for the Civil War, and even though the South lost the Civil War, today there is still racial bigotry in various areas of the South. While most of the South's population was Scots-Irish, English, or African, there were two other types of people that also lived there. Cajun people, French-speaking Catholic people, created their own culture in the bayous of Louisiana, adding their French dialects, spicy food, and unique music to the South's rich and dispersed culture. Hailing from Acadia, aka Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, traveling south and living in Louisiana further added to the culture of the Deep South. Also, Native Americans were a part of the South's population. Sadly, however, in the 1830s, led by Andrew Jackson, purge campaigns were supported by the government, forcefully removed Cherokee Native Americans from their homelands in the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee to Oklahoma on a trek called the Trail of Tears. While a lot of Native Americans were gone, the remaining also morphed some of their culture into the South, such as the names of towns or states, just like Tennessee. Another important cultural aspect in the South is its close ties to religion. Overwhelmingly evangelical Protestant small rural churches sprang up all over the South with weekly sermons on Sundays and an employed preacher. Types of denominations include Pentecostals, Methodist, and Episcopal. However, overwhelmingly in the South, Baptists make up the largest Protestant denomination. Finding settlers ready to hear what they had to say, as our text says on page 171, frontier hardship, isolation, and individualism were compatible with a religion adopted through intensely emotional but personal conversion experiences. This is the reason why Baptist was so popular. This pattern of religion survives to this day, morphing the South into what is known as a part of the Bible Belt. And often there are churches about on every corner. Lastly, by the time the Civil War began, Southern landowners were still pushing for slave labor, seeing opportunities in fresh, new, fertile places such as the Panhandle of Florida or the Bluegrass Basin in Kentucky. This further spread of Southern influence went to the deeper parts of the interior of the country. When the South eventually lost the Civil War, however, its economy was in ruins. Along with the Confederate currency being worth nothing and the total collapse of the economy, the largest part of it, slave labor, was completely disintegrated and disbanded. Southerners were worried about their livelihoods and their future. However, ultimately, falling back on the deepest parts of their distinct culture, the South slowly rebuilt itself into what we see today, and continuing to change today. As you can see, the South has culturally been impacted from a combination of agrarian settlement patterns, slave labor, and an addition of various cultural groups and religions that have been incorporated together to become the South that we know and love today. Perhaps Clyde Edgerton said it best: "Because I was born in the South, I am a Southerner. If I had been born in the North, the West, or the Midwest, Central Plains, I would be just a human being."